It was a night 3 weeks before Christmas in 2010 when Joseph Brandon Creel switched his phone on silent so he could enjoy a romantic evening with his girlfriend. Creel was an oil worker and former college football player, but he was also the shot caller for a prison gang, but living in the free world, so moments of peace and quiet like this were rare. His dinner date went as planned, but when Creel walked into his girlfriend's living room and happened to glance at his phone, he noticed that there were about 40 missed calls. Creel sighed, picked up the phone, and called back, only to be greeted with an urgent request. A situation got out of hand, a voice on the other end told him. Creel hurriedly put on his clothes and hopped on his motorcycle, making the trip out to a remote trailer in Petal, Mississippi, where he was greeted by 2 nervous men, followed by the smell of cleaning chemicals and death. Inside the trailer was a dead body wrapped in a rug. The other 2 had created this problem, and now Creel was being called in to deal with it. The victim's name was Michael Hudson, but he went by Skip, and the reason he was hogtied and deceased inside a floor cloth was all because of the Aryan Brotherhood of Mississippi, a prison and street gang that Skip and his killers were all a part of. Just a few weeks earlier, Skip had been totally cool with all of the men who now faced the unpleasant task of making sure his body would never be found. His death was the result of an escalating situation rooted in gang politics and the meth trade. As the 3 men got to work, none of them could have known that just a couple hours earlier in the evening, they'd been in the company of an FBI informant who had witnessed key events in the kidnapping, beating, and eventual murder of Michael Skip Hudson. The informant had even typed out a text message to alert the feds, which would have prevented the whole thing and saved Skip's life. But he didn't hit send. For in that moment, the fear of this notorious Southern white prison gang was greater than the fear of a federal prison cell. The Aryan Brotherhood of Mississippi was formed in 1984, roughly 2 decades after the foundation of the original Aryan Brotherhood in California. As such, the ABM modeled itself after the pre-existing gangs of the same name in California and Texas, but took on its own values and symbolism. For instance, the ABM adopted a paramilitary structure with captains, lieutenants, sergeant-at-arms, soldiers, and prospects, as well as a governing body known as the Wheel, which consisted of 3 generals known as spokes. The spokes were generally incarcerated, but not always, as Joseph Brandon Creel was serving as an out-of-custody spoke in December 2010, when these aforementioned events took place. The ABM was founded in the Mississippi Department of Corrections, which for years has maintained one of the most violent, corrupt, and underfunded state prison systems that attracts the ire of the Department of Justice during both Republican and Democratic administrations. Over the years, the ABM's presence expanded from prisons across the entire state of Mississippi, as the gang became the premier choice for white inmates and as some of its members were paroled. After gaining a presence throughout the Mississippi free world, the ABM divided geographically by northern, central, and southern Mississippi, with each of the 3 spokes in the wheel taking responsibility for one of the zones. Regardless of whether a spoke controls the north, central, or south, an order from him is to be obeyed by any ABM member without question. The Aryan Brotherhood of Mississippi embraces many slogans, colors, and symbols. They display the number 13, signifying the letter M for Mississippi. Their main patch has changed 4 times, but generally includes an amalgamation of the letters A and B in a way that could easily confuse people who are unfamiliar with it. Like many Aryan Brotherhood gangs, this symbol is known as a brand when tattooed. Within the ABM is something of an elite squad, known as the Thunder Warriors, who signify their status by receiving a brand of lightning bolts, typically on a Thunder Warrior's neck. ABM members become Thunder Warriors by committing multiple acts of violence that have been confirmed by witnesses. Although, as we'll explore, having multiple witnesses to their violent crimes hasn't always worked out too well. The ABM likes blue, gold and silver, black, and blue and red combined, with each color scheme representing something different. Blue and red are the gang's battle colors. Blue alone represents the blue blood upper echelon of the ABM. Gold and silver tie back to their belief in a strong Aryan nation, and black represents their uniform colors. They've taken on slogans like, "Where Aryan boots thread, there will be respect or bloodshed," as well as, "From man to man, from brother to brother, together in battle, for a cause." They also use as a slogan the name of an Irish nationalist political party, Sinn Féin, translated roughly as, "We ourselves alone." The ABM also has a 5-step secret handshake for its members to learn and perform on one another. They sometimes refer to themselves as the family, and members on the outside meet up once weekly for meetings known as church. Incarcerated ABM spokes generally use cell phones smuggled into prison to communicate, and did so with enough ease that it never seemed to be a problem. If you would have liked to have joined the ABM, you must have proved yourself worthy through more than just violence. Prospects are quizzed with questions like, do you believe in death before dishonor? Could you use terrorist tactics to teach someone a lesson? Do you believe that a government ran by the minority would be better or worse than the present world? If, after you are released, you are ordered to terminate another person, could you do so without any explanation or hesitation? There is also a general belief within the ABM that racial separatism or being pro-segregation is different from racism, though they are well aware that most people do not distinguish between the two, nor do they care to dignify such a distinction. A prospect begins his journey by reading a letter asking them to pledge their life and maybe die for the cause of white supremacy. It's too long to recite the entire thing, but here's a small taste. Dear prospect, you stand forewarned of an increasing risk to you. Should you not be selected to be promoted to brother status, you shall remain under an oath of secrecy upon penalty of death if you ever reveal any of your knowledge to anyone. If acceptance is not given to you, don't lose heart. Keep faith in white supremacy and the future of the Aryan cause. The Aryan cause goes deeper than you can imagine or what you shall learn in the short time given. We must be sure that those chosen will all follow Aryan heritage and have a pure and sincere heart. For members who disobey orders or gang rules, there are various forms of discipline. These can include minutes, meaning 2 minutes of fighting with 2 other ABM members, or the Thunderdome, where a whole pile of members basically dogpile and assault you. There's also the smash on sight, which can range from a brutal assault to actually burning or carving off a member's tattoo, or a kill on sight, which seems pretty self-explanatory. They also have a designated treasurer to keep track of the gang's coffers, most of which are funded by the sale of crystal meth. While there is evidence the ABM has connections in California and other states, much of their methamphetamine was self-produced, thanks to relatively lax laws in adjacent states that allowed for the bulk purchases of precursors. Most of these drugs were sold within Mississippi, which has consistently been one of the poorest states in America. It should also be noted that during the early 2010s, the ABM was attempting to parlay with the California Aryan Brotherhood to arrange some type of unification, which would have required the ABM to adopt a new constitution and symbols, though it doesn't appear to have gone through. All of that brings us to the murder of Michael "Skip" Hudson. In the early 2010s, Aryan Brotherhood of Mississippi members Eric Parker and Joseph Brandon Creel were making a nice living selling meth, including to other ABM members like Hudson. But in late 2010, Parker was still getting flack from some for giving out bad product. When one ABM member named Walter T-Bone Burris complained, Parker replaced it with the high-quality stuff and made things right. It was around the same time that Parker fronted Hudson $600 worth of methamphetamine to sell, then waited and waited and waited for Hudson to pay him back. The money never came. Parker complained about the situation to Creel, who saw himself as a father figure to Parker, but also didn't really want to bring the ABM into what seemed to him more like a personal problem than gang business. Still, Creel ordered Hudson to endure a minute's punishment for failure to repay the debt, and the minutes was supposed to take place at an upcoming church meeting. Instead, Hudson failed to show up and take his beating, drastically raising the level of what was otherwise a fairly standard and innocuous situation. Now, Hudson had disobeyed a direct order from his spoke, and had done so in a way that kind of made him appear to be a coward. On the other hand, it was Hudson's contention that Parker had given him dirty dope that he couldn't use or sell, and was now basically trying to extort $600 from him. Still, ABM rules are taken seriously, and by failing to show up for the fight, Hudson lost what hope he had to get folks to take his side. That's where a man named Frankie Owens enters the story. Like Parker, he was an ABM captain in the free world, and he was too involved in the meth trade. In fact, Parker and Owens had recently been busted in Arkansas, where they freely admitted to police that they were going to buy precursor chemicals for a meth lab. Owens was angered and offended by Hudson's actions. He was also a thunder warrior with a proven propensity for violence, and told everyone who would listen that he intended to gift wrap Hudson and bring him to Parker. Then he did exactly that. Hudson still had a few ABM members whom he trusted, and one of them, James Dean, had recently warned Hudson, when they had bumped into each other at a Walgreens, that others wanted to kill him. So when Dean asked Hudson to come help them cook up some meth at ABM member Walter Eves' home in Gaudier, Mississippi, Hudson felt safe enough to do so. It was a costly mistake. As Hudson was coming over, Owens was cutting wiring down to 5 feet so they'd have a good length to hog-tie Hudson and take him to Parker. When Hudson walked in, ABM members Eves, Owens, Burris, Mitchell Valentine, and ABM prospect Sonny Mitchell took turns beating him, while others stood there watching. Then they wired him up and threw him into the trunk of a car. Owens cursed out Hudson as they drove to Parker's trailer. When they got there, they let Hudson take a couple drags of a cigarette, then brought him inside. Everyone except Owens, Parker, and Hudson left. Only Owens and Parker know exactly what happened next. One story that surfaced was that Parker choked Hudson. Another was that Owens was responsible, but made Parker take part so they'd share liability. Either way, the end result was Creel receiving the frantic call for help and making that fateful motorcycle ride over to the trailer of death. No one knew it then, but James Dean, the man who'd lured Hudson to his kidnapping and death, had been working for the FBI for years. And as he sat on the sidelines watching the violence at Eve's home, he would later claim that he had a text message ready to go, alerting an FBI agent of the matter. Had Dean sent this, or had he bothered to warn the FBI in advance rather than assisting in the kidnapping, Hudson would likely have escaped his grisly end. Dean would later claim he was too scared to act. After Creel arrived at Parker's trailer, they stuffed Hudson's body in a drum, drove it to Creel's home, dug a giant fire pit, filled it with tires and wood, and then Creel poured out a huge jug of gasoline before running off a gasoline fuse and lighting it up. When asked how he did this without setting himself on fire, he'd later explain, "I'm from the country." The fire burned for 4 to 5 days, after which Creel scooped up the remains and dumped them in a nearby river. No trace of Hudson was ever found. Owens would go on to be promoted from captain to spoke. But the ABM had left enough eyewitnesses that leaks were bound to start, and it didn't help that Owens announced that Hudson was never coming back, and no one should ever discuss him again during the subsequent church meeting. A few of the members went into hiding, but they generally continued on with their lives until the feds brought forth a wiretap that exposed the ABM's massive statewide meth business and brought in 17 defendants, including members, leaders, prospects, and so-called featherwoods, meaning women whose job it was to smuggle contraband into prison, launder money, and transport drugs. At this point, many within the ABM were willing to tattle on Parker and Owens in exchange for a better deal. These included not just guys like Burris, Valentine, Maxwell, and Dean, but also Creel and another former spoke named Perry Mask. At the trial, Creel said he felt guilty turning on men he had love for, but also said he blamed Parker for getting him into another fine mess by calling him over to the trailer in the first place. "It's cost me my life, 25 years. If it would have been anybody but Eric Parker, they'd have been on their own." The trial revealed that by the time the group was indicted, Owens was reportedly plotting to kill Eric Parker next, telling others he feared Parker didn't have the stomach for cold-blooded murder and would start telling on the group next. Parker's girlfriend seemed to bolster this idea, testifying that he would wake up screaming in cold sweats and confessed that he'd killed someone and was still haunted by it. Defense attorneys argued simply that Hudson wasn't dead and pointed out that Creel admitted that he hadn't actually looked inside the rug to make sure it was actually Hudson in there. This argument, while interesting, was unpersuasive. And soon after the trial's end, the Department of Justice was touting yet another guilty verdict in a RICO case centered on betrayal within a gang. In addition to the murder, Owens was convicted of arranging the stabbing of a former ABM member for threatening to sexually abuse a woman and her young daughter. An ABM member named Scissorhands committed the stabbing after a prison church Sunday service. We'll close the story on this note. Time and time again, during Owens and Parker's trial, jurors would watch a former Aryan Brotherhood of Mississippi member walk in, sit on the witness stand, and give a brief autobiography describing their hopes and dreams for the future, as well as their criminal histories. Then the prosecutor would ask each one what had been the downfall of their lives. None of them said gang life, or their rough upbringings, or even doing a hard time in prison. Instead, they all had the same answer. It was crystal meth.